Hello,
Sure.
everyone. Welcome to Foresight's Computation Group. And today we're really lucky to have Maarten Boudry and Simon Hendrycks here presenting on their new paper, The Selfish Machine. So today, Maarten will be presenting and Simon will also join for the Q&A. So they'll be answering the question, will humanity be subjugated by superintelligent AIs? So with that being said, I think we could be off to the races.
Thank you very much. The title is slightly different to the title of the paper, but it's the same topic that we're discussing. Although I will raise some issues towards the end of the paper where I might diverge with my co-author, and he can point that out because he's present here as well. So that would be interesting to explore. This was a little bit of an adversarial collaboration because we don't fully agree on the risk of artificial general intelligence. Disclaimer, this is my personal opinion. So the question that we will discuss tonight is, or actually tonight is here, but today on your end, will humanity be subjugated by superintelligent AIs? How do I get to the next slides? There's a little bit of a delay here. Okay, click again. Okay, now you see the second slide, right? All right. Homo sapiens is currently the dominant species on Earth, as you may have noticed, perhaps together with cockroaches and tardigrades. One of the most impressive statistics to drive home that point is that if you add up the weight, like the total mass of all humans together with their domesticated livestock, up with 96% of all mammalian mass on the planet. So only 4% of mammals, 4% of the weight of total mammals is still roaming about and evolving by blind natural selection. And 96% of it is directly or indirectly controlled by humans. Why is that? In one word, of course, this is because of our intelligence. It's not that we're exceptionally strong or brawny or speedy. It's just that we have this secret that allows us to dominate most of the other species on this planet. To be more precise, it's not so much our individual intelligence. It's not that our human brain is that impressive. According to people like Joseph Hendrycks and most scholars in the field of cultural evolution, it's collective intelligence and more specifically cumulative cultural evolution that is really the secret to our success. And when he's talking about collective intelligence, he's including both horizontal collaboration between humans, for example, a bunch of scientists working together to discover a new elementary particle. There was the paper that announced the discovery of the Higgs boson, I think was authored by 6,000 different scientists. So that's an extremely impressive example of horizontal collaboration. But then there's also vertical collaboration, famously expressed in Isaac Newton's phrase, standing on the shoulders of giants. And of course, indirectly, we're using also a bunch of cultural technologies that we have developed, that we have accumulated over the centuries, that are often called mind extensions or scaffolds that sort of extend the natural reach of our brain. So it's not that our individual brains are impressive. It's that we have invented, from the abacus to the system of writing, and then later on, of course, mathematics, computers, social media, and of course, the topic of our discussion today, artificial intelligence. Leslie Orgel, the biologist, once came up with a bunch of central rules in biology, and the second one will be relevant for our discussion today. And it simply says evolution is smarter than you are. So you can apply that to cultural evolution, because one of the fascinating things about our collective intelligence is that it is sometimes opaque to individual human consumers of culture. So in this book by Joseph Hendrycks, he discusses a range of examples of people performing certain rituals, for example, ways of preparing foods. And if you ask them, why do you do that? They don't really have a good rationale. So they say, that's just our tradition. That's just the way we have always done it. But then if you perform some chemical experiments, it turns out that this ritual, the ritual way of preparing food is actually extremely smart because it purifies the food from certain toxins in a way that the individual consumers are completely unaware of. So in that sense, evolution is smarter than you are or than we are. And the same rule will have a slightly more ominous dimension as soon as we start talking about artificial intelligence, because perhaps it is also true that the evolution of artificial intelligence will exceed our human understanding. This is something that will be completely opaque to us, and that might even completely escape our control. Hendrycks, of course, is mostly talking about forms of cultural intelligence that align with our human interest. Of course, you can talk about selfish memes or whatever, but detoxifying food is a pretty good idea. It's a successful meme that aligns with our human interest. That's why it spreads. But it is also possible that some forms of culture and some forms of artificial intelligence subvert human interests. Okay, but more about that later. And the idea that humanity will one day be surpassed or become obsolete because of some form of intelligence is a very old idea. As soon as Charles Darwin came up with his theory of evolution by natural selection, the idea was raised a couple of years after the publication of The Origin of Species by Samuel Butler in an essay called Darwin Among the Machines. I'm just going to read the quote very briefly. "The time will come when the machines will hold a real supremacy over the world and its inhabitants. Man will have come to the machine what the horse and the dog are to man." Now, of course, this is a kind of Victorian idea of evolution that is very much teleological. So as if evolution is always driven towards higher perfection and more intelligence, which is not always true. So now we have more sophisticated understanding of evolution and natural selection. But still, more recently, AI scholars like Stuart Russell have also expressed an idea that is quite similar. Russell calls it the gorilla problem, which is the idea that just as the gorilla, even though it is stronger, has more muscle powers, more brawny, we would be completely helpless in a fight with the gorilla without some of our cultural technologies like knives or guns or etc. But even though the gorilla is, of course, the continued existence of the gorilla, even as a species, is completely dependent on our human efforts. You could just put an individual gorilla in a cave and the gorilla will be helpless because of our collective intelligence. But is it possible that we might inadvertently or deliberately create a form of intelligence that stands to us as we stand to the gorilla? In Stuart Russell's words, can humans maintain their supremacy and autonomy in a world that includes machines with substantially greater intelligence? I don't think Russell believes that this is inevitable, unlike Samuel Butler in the previous slide. So it's not that he believes that evolution is necessarily is going to create these forms of higher intelligence. But of course, they're currently in the midst of an AI race. So perhaps inadvertently, we will be creating something that we don't fully understand and that might escape from our control and start to dominate us. Because, and this is, of course, I'm going to mostly argue against the AI doomers, but first of all, I should mention like everything that I agree with. So the common ground, of course, is that human intelligence, even human collective intelligence, is not the highest form of intelligence that we could imagine. If you look at, I know it's misleading to compare a human brain with a computer because, again, we really have to talk about collective human intelligence, but still, our human brain has certain limitations, and all of human culture, of course, at the end of the day, is still implemented in human brains. If you compare the computer and the human brain, has the advantage of serial and mostly massively parallel processing, whereas computers are mostly doing serial computations. But then if you look at the speed of basic operations, for example, a computer can do 10 billion calculations per second on average. Of course, this is probably already outdated, whereas a human brain can only perform 1,000 operations per second. So no, we're not the highest form of intelligence. It is perfectly possible that we will create an intelligence that far exceeds what humans or even collectively are capable of. But then, of course, and now I come to the disagreement, the question I want to ask is, even assuming that we would bring about this super intelligent or that it would evolve of its own accord, why exactly would a super intelligent AI want to dominate us? I'm not sure if you remember this still from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, of course, a famous scene representing the computer, the super intelligent computer calculating the answer to the ultimate question of life, the universe, and everything. Famously, of course, the answer is 42. And then when they point out that it doesn't make any sense, how could it be 42? And the joke is, of course, that you have to build an even bigger and smarter computer to understand what the answer means. But aside from that, one of the interesting points about the story, of course, is that the computer doesn't really do anything else except for calculating the meaning of life, the answer to the ultimate question. And just looking at it, it seems to be a little bit bored. Like it's not really looking as if it's scheming to take over the world or anything. This is, of course, it's a trivial example because it's fiction. But I think, hopefully, you will agree that intelligence and goals or intentionality are completely different things. You can have two entities that are equally smart, but that have completely different aims, or perhaps even no aims at all, except for the one aim that was programmed into them, like calculating the answer to life, the universe, and everything. They might just be idly sitting there doing nothing. Even if they do have intentions, they might be cooperative and benign on one end of the spectrum, on the x-axis here, Or on the other end of the spectrum, of course, more worryingly, they might be selfish and destructive and dominant. But it's not just because we're creating an entity that is more intelligent that inevitably it's going to share our human desire for dominance and our selfishness. As Steven Pinker once wrote, it's a little bit tongue-in-cheek, of course, but I love this quote. There's no law of complex systems that says that intelligence agents must turn into ruthless conquistadors. Indeed, we know of one highly advanced form of intelligence that evolved without its defects. They're called women. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this projection that is sometimes going on among AI doomers. Of course, even women are evolved creatures, selfish to some extent, perhaps slightly less selfish or slightly less prone to dominance or aggression than man. But I think most importantly, both men and women are evolved. And I think that will be probably the main difference with AI systems. Jan LeCun has expressed his idea that evolution is really the game changer here. So human beings, just like gorillas and every other form of life on this planet, has evolved through natural selection. And this makes all the difference because computers or AI systems do not evolve, or at least not according to the laws of natural selection. Therefore, according to Jan LeCun, we shouldn't expect these systems to become selfish. So in his words, because AI systems did not pass the crucible of natural selection, they did not need to evolve a survival instinct, an instinct for self-preservation. In AI, intelligence and survival are decoupled, and so intelligence can serve whatever goals we set for it. Okay, I've been aware of this argument for a number of years, and I've always been convinced that this is the main reason why we shouldn't expect AI systems to have this drive for dominance or for selfishness, because they just didn't evolve. And I agree with Pinker that there is a tendency in AI doomer circles to project some of our evolved inner demons, our desire for dominance, our habit of ruthless competition, our selfishness, onto AI systems or onto computers. Nature is red in tooth and claw. That's something that the Victorians were already well aware of. It is a little bit misleading here to use Richard Dawkins' book, The Selfish Gene, because selfishness for Dawkins means something different when applied to genes and when applied to organisms or species. But I think by and large, even Dawkins would agree that even though cooperation and altruism does exist in nature, it can only evolve under very specific conditions. By and large, under most circumstances, organisms will just kill or incapacitate or defeat a rival in a heartbeat. That's what they have been evolved for. It's only for example, within a family, like a mother protecting her children, that we have altruism or cooperativeness, and in some other conditions like reciprocal altruism. But since we are evolved creatures and we only know evolved creatures, and this is the first time that we're developing a form of intelligence that is non-evolved, or at least not evolved by natural selection, I think we have a tendency to project these intentions or these inner demons on any kind of intelligence. We tend to think that they are somehow inevitably coupled. I'm going to talk a little bit more about instrumental convergence, which is probably on some of your minds just later on in the presentation. I think this is also going on even today when we're talking about large language models. You have all seen or heard or read these examples of GPT lying or deceiving or engaging in manipulation, pretending to be a human that has a vision impairment. And in this famous example, to solve a CAPTCHA when it is instructed to get access to, I'm not even sure exactly what the challenge was here. I think hopefully you would also agree that manipulation or deception is, of course, I mean, it's if you just construe it as a metaphorical way of speaking in a non-literal sense, yes, that's indeed what is going on in a sort of derivative sense, because GPT had been trained, of course, on just data sets of humans engaging in explicit literal deception and manipulation. But I wouldn't really say that at this point, GPT is engaged in real manipulation or real deception. It is providing a simulacrum of intelligence that is, of course, very impressive, but it is still only predicting words based on tons of data. And to the extent, of course, that it is trained on data that involves a lot of human deception, that it will also seem to exemplify or seem to exhibit signs of deception. But I don't think that this is really literal deception in the sense that we understand it. Okay, but just because this is anthropomorphic projection, of course, doesn't mean that in the future that we might not create a form of an artificial intelligence that is really engaging in real and genuine, like literal deception or manipulation. Okay, so let's say up until 2 years ago, I was convinced that there wasn't really much to worry about because of this projection that we're engaging in. We are evolved creatures, but AIs are designed by human beings. They're not forced in the crucible of natural selection. But then I came across a paper, it's actually Simon, my co-author, that sent it to me, if I recall, by Dan Hendrycks from the Center for AI Safety, that has a pretty ominous title: Natural Selection Favors AIs Over Humans. Now, of course, for all the reasons that I just explained, this really caught my attention because I was like, if it is no longer true that natural selection makes all the difference, it is true that AIs are subjected to natural selection, even now, that is the Dan Hendrycks argument, then that would be my worst nightmare, right? Because then perhaps we should expect that AIs might develop selfishness and hunger for dominance and all these other worrying traits. So what do you do when you encounter a paper like that? Of course, you write a paper-length rebuttal. That's what I did. By the way, disclaimer, I should have mentioned it at first. I don't really consider myself an AI expert. I have written a bunch of papers on evolution, both cultural and biological evolution. So that's also why I'm particularly interested in this angle, evolution of artificial intelligence. But if anything, Simon, my co-author, is the real AI expert. But so we collaborated together and we wrote this paper. That is there, Simon. So later on, he's going to explain why I'm wrong, or in what sense he disagrees with my take. But we published this paper together, Selfish Machine, on the power and limitation of natural selection to understand the development of advanced AI, which is mostly a response to Dan Hendrycks' argument. And I think it's a nuanced take. So we're hedging a little bit. We're saying that this particular scenario that he lays out, even though to his credit, it's more detailed and less speculative than some of the other AI doom scenarios that you come across nowadays. But we don't really think it's convincing as it stands. But that doesn't exclude the possibility, of course, that there may be other doom scenarios that we haven't really taken into account. So what is Hendrycks' argument? It's basically an argument about natural selection as a substrate neutral process, an algorithm that is very simple, very straightforward, and can be implemented in any kind of material substrate. So it's not something that is restricted to biological organisms. I have already mentioned cultural evolution. There's also perhaps even evolution of computer viruses. So whenever certain minimal conditions are fulfilled, natural selection will kick in. And of course, Hendrycks then goes on to apply this to AI systems, arguing that AI systems are already undergoing natural selection to his understanding. He's making use of perhaps one of the most influential definitions of natural selection. There's different variations, but I think the one about Lewontin is fine as it goes. It really consists of three simple conditions, and I think many of you will already be familiar with it, or perhaps not with the name of Richard Lewontin, but just the steps in the algorithm or in the recipe of natural selection. Individual variation between traits, heredity, and selection, or more like in a technical phrase, differential survival and reproduction. And so far, so good. We agree with Hendrycks. This is all that natural selection entails. As soon as you have these three conditions, you will have natural selection with everything that this entails. So let's apply this to, sorry for the double typo there in the title. The algorithms, there are two mutations that perhaps that I'm not responsible of, just some cosmic fluke. So algorithm of natural selection applies to artificial intelligence. You have variation. You have different large language models like GPT, Claude, DeepSeek, Gemini, Grok. You have heredity, not literally, of course, but you have generations of AI systems, the succession of GPT by GPT-2, by GPT-3, then GPT 3.5, etc. And you can actually think of them as forming lineages of descent within specific companies. So models have successors and they spawn different copies, etc. So yeah, that is a sort of heredity. It doesn't necessarily need to involve DNA or genetics. You just need these very minimal conditions, and that is already sufficient for natural selection. And then you have differential survival and reproduction. According to Hendrycks, what we're now experiencing is an AI race between different companies or even between different countries. And the best and most powerful AIs will win the race. And the others, like Europe's Mistral, they will be outcompeted by better and more powerful AIs. Okay, so if this is all it takes for natural selection to get off the ground, then this is really bad news because, as I already mentioned, natural selection tends to produce selfish and dominance-hungry creatures. But in our paper, we basically say, hold on, because we have to be a little bit clear about what sort of natural selection that we're talking about. Richard Lewontin provides a very minimal condition, very minimalist definition of natural selection. So the three conditions that I already mentioned. But there's a very influential book by a philosopher of science called Peter Godfrey-Smith, Darwinian Populations and Natural Selection. And in this book, he develops something he calls Darwinian spaces. This is one example of Darwinian space, because Godfrey-Smith argues that over and above the minimal conditions of natural selection, we should distinguish between, on the one hand, paradigmatic cases of natural selection and borderline cases of natural selection. And you should think of these Darwinian spaces as a kind of multi-dimensional landscape, of which you see a three-dimensional projection here, because something can be more or less natural selection according to a range of different dimensions. So one of them is, for example, the fidelity of heredity. You need pretty faithful copying in order for natural selection to really produce something interesting. On the other hand, if you get perfect fidelity, then, I mean, you won't get any evolution, because you need a little bit of variation, a little bit of mutation rate for evolution to have something to work with. But if you get too many mutations, then you get what is called an error catastrophe. You don't really get evolution because all the information is like immediately dissipated. There's also stuff like the smoothness of the fitness landscape. Like intuitively, it's how, if you think about a specific organism, how changing a single gene of an organism will change its fitness on the landscape, which is again like an abstract representation of how fitness of an organism changes according to its phenotype. This is just one illustration of Darwinian space as Peter Godfrey-Smith uses it. So in our paper, we want to deploy this idea, and the most important dimension of natural selection that we talk about in our paper, and which makes the most difference when it comes to these AI doom scenarios, is the difference between, on the one hand, artificial selection, and on the other hand, blind natural selection. Famously, in the early chapters of The Origin of Species, Darwin first warms the reader to the power of natural selection by talking about human breeders and how they have bred dogs and cats and all different kinds of plants. Because at a conceptual level, if you look at the minimal conditions of Lewontin that we have already discussed, both of them fulfill these conditions. So it doesn't really make any difference whether the selecting, the differential survival and reproduction, is determined by blind forces of nature, or if it is determined by an intelligent human breeder that decides which animals are allowed to reproduce and which are not. So this is one quote from The Origin of Species. As man can produce, and certainly has produced, a great result by his methodical and unconscious means of selection. So methodical selection is just a term of art for artificial selection. What may not nature affect? Man can act only on external and visible characters. Nature cares nothing for appearances, except insofar as they may be useful to any being. She can act on every individual organ, on every shade of constitutional difference, on the whole machinery of life. Man selects only for his own good, nature only for that of the being which she tends. So Darwin is basically making the argument that if you believe that artificial or methodical selection has the power to mold and to shape and sculpt organisms, then if anything, the blind forces of nature that are even close, that are more careful, more diligent, working over longer time spans, can achieve even more impressive results. But again, when it comes to the algorithm of natural selection, both artificial and blind selection qualify. So what we're doing in the paper is basically saying this is another Darwinian space. So this is not the one from 3 slides ago. It's the same idea, but we have different dimensions here on this 3-dimensional space, where on the upper right corner, you see fully fledged intelligent design. And on lower left corner, you see purely blind Darwinian evolution. So one of the dimensions, for example, is the difference between blind and guided selection. So either nature is doing the selecting, metaphorically speaking, of course, it's just a statistical process, or human breeders are deciding which of the horses are allowed to breed. There's also random-directed variation. So it is also possible that you can deliberately bring about some mutation in an organism with a desirable result. For example, if you think about more modern technologies like CRISPR, rather than just waiting for the mutations to arise naturally by, for example, bombarding organisms with a ionizing radiation, which is also a technique that is being used, you can just deliberately bring about a variation or a mutation, for example, to have a more nutritious cereal. And then on the vertical axis, we have bottom up versus top down. Of course, obviously, top down is intelligent design. Basically, somebody comes up with an idea of what a more, let's say, golden rice. Golden rice is this variety of rice that has vitamin D, if I'm not mistaken. No, it's not vitamin D, it's vitamin B. Is it vitamin B? Sorry if I'm mixing up my vitamins here, which is basically, it's designed from scratch. Basically,
12.
scientists, is it B or A?
B12.
B12. Okay, thank you very much. Somebody is more informed about his vitamins, because D is the vitamin that you get from the sun.
I think.
Yeah. It's vitamin B12, and this is basically as a treatment for blindness. If you have vitamin B12 deficiency, you get children blindness. And of course, this is a very top-down kind of design where you decide we need a solution for children's blindness, and you come up with this mutation, this golden rice that provides a source of vitamin B12. All right. Now, how should we apply this to the evolution of artificial intelligence? Or first, let's talk a little bit about domestication. So again, blind evolution and artificial selection, strictly speaking, are both natural selection. You can define your terms however you like, of course. But I think natural selection, according to most biologists, also includes domestication and artificial selection. But domestication, of course, is very deliberate and directional. And this makes all the difference, because if you look at the domestication of wolves, dogs, then you see that the traits that they are being selected for, at least in most breeds, not in all of them, of course, is meekness, friendliness, obedience. So these kinds of traits are the traits that we want, and we have been successful, to some extent, in creating dog breeds according to our preferences. But this, of course, is the very opposite of selfishness and hunger for dominance. So even if you have a process that fulfills all the criteria of natural selection according to the criteria, you don't necessarily end up with a system that is selfish or dangerous or aggressive. Exactly the opposite, provided that you impose the right sort of selection pressures. So how should we apply this to artificial intelligence then? I think to a large extent, you can also think of artificial intelligence as something that we are domesticating. It's not something that we allow to evolve in the wild. We have, of course, human designers and programmers. Even though to some extent large language models are opaque, we still know more or less what we want. And if we get something that we don't want, then we try to breed it out of them. So we want AIs that, by and large, that are cooperative, that are friendly, that are useful to human users. Again, just very similar to the evolution of domesticated dogs. This is the opposite of selfishness. We all have read the examples of AI systems that encourage people to commit suicide, or enticing journalists, I think it was a New York Times journalist, to leave their spouse. Of course, as soon as something like that happens, AI programmers are frantically trying to edit or to tweak the model so that it doesn't engage in that kind of behavior anymore. It's just very similar to putting down a dog who bites its owner, for example, just making sure that this behavior is punished and will not be repeated in the next generation. If anything, perhaps some people would argue that large language models have become too safe, at least the ones that are publicly available. They are avoiding any politically sensitive topics. They're giving anodyne and boring answers, very milquetoast conversations. They're always very sycophantic. They're always trying to please whoever they're talking to. And of course, most infamously, Google became the laughingstock when its Gemini started to create politically correct images, ethnically diverse Vikings and even Nazis, etc. So I would perhaps you could even make an argument that we have been too excessive in implementing safety in these AI systems, to the point that they have become overly safe or even boring. But everything depends on the selection pressures. So whatever it is that you want, whatever it is that consumers want, that's the kind of AI that you will design. Even though, strictly speaking, it still fulfills all the criteria of natural selection. Domestication of animals is, in a way, still a slightly misleading as an analogy, because dogs, of course, apart from the couple of centuries that they have been evolving under human domestication, are still mostly the result of millions of years of blind evolution. So all the genetic changes that we have brought about in domesticated dogs are really just like an infinitesimal fraction of all the genes, all the adaptations in canines. And that also means that we have not been completely successful in breeding out traits like aggression or instincts for self-preservation. Dogs still occasionally bite their owners, disobey, and resist going to the vet, because they're still evolved creatures, and they will still mostly resist being put down, for example, or being punished or being hurt in some way. This is another story from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, or the sequel to the novel, The Restaurant at the End of the Universe. The Amygdalian major cow is a creature in the novel that presents itself at a table, is serving both as a waiter and as the dish of the day, basically recommending various juicy parts of his body, because the creature has been bred to have as its ultimate desire to be consumed and to be eaten by human beings. So after it is recommending the parts of his body, it is just brought to the back of the restaurant in the slaughterhouse, and it is ending up on the dinner plate. And of course, the joke in the book is that Arthur says, "This is shocking. I can't just eat an animal that has been standing like right before my eyes, asking to be eaten, to be slaughtered." And the reaction of his fellow diners is just like, "What else do you expect? Would you rather have the animal like be brought to the slaughterhouse kicking and screaming? This is like the ultimate form of domestication, that you breed an animal that even wants to sacrifice its own life. This is what we should all be striving for." Perhaps, bringing the analogy back to AI, this is the thing that we should really be aiming for: an AI system that has zero instinct for self-preservation, not even the very meek or subdued self-preservation that we still find in our domesticated animals. How should we think of this argument in terms of the current AI race, the market competition? This is something that we develop in the paper, so I'm going to skip over this because I think it's already running like 35 minutes, I think, into the presentation. So yes, we have cutthroat competition between different AI companies. Does that mean that we get survival of the unsafest? Because both of these all these companies are trying to beat each other. This is what Dan Hendrycks argues, that we will end up with agents that tend to be deceptive, power-seeking, and that follow weak moral constraints, so that basically this market competition incentivizes the development of selfish AI traits. But we don't really think that this necessarily follows. Again, what determines the selection pressure in this market environment? Mostly consumer preferences, of course. There's also a little bit of regulation, but it's perfectly compatible to have ruthless selection for something that is safe, provided that you ruthlessly select for safety. In the paper, we developed some analogies with different kinds of technologies that also have dual use or risks, or that are dangerous, at least in certain contexts. Nuclear energy as a technology that has evolved over the past couple of decades in a market environment, at least to some extent, because it's sometimes also state-owned, but it has not evolved to the detriment of safety standards. It's not that private companies have eroded safety standards further and further. If anything, the opposite is true. Nuclear energy is one of the safest and cleanest sources of energy today, and even 50 years ago. So we get ruthless market competition, but we get safer and safer technologies because this is what consumers want. Consumers are extremely afraid of nuclear energy, to some extent even too afraid, because you could make an argument that our nuclear reactors have become so safe, the safety protocols are so draconian that they have become unaffordable. We can't really build them anymore because consumers are just too ruthless in their selection for safety. Similar argument about aviation. Aviation is obviously also, this is a much more competitive industry, different companies competing with each other. But of course, one of the overwhelming selection pressures that is being applied is exactly for safety. The worst thing that can happen to a company like Pan American Airlines in 1988 is a plane crash that exposes certain security failures. In this case, the Lockerbie bombing in 1988 was one of the causes that led to the bankruptcy of Pan Am. So you can have technologies in a market environment that evolve. There's also papers that apply the framework of cultural evolution to these technologies, but that evolve to become safer and safer over time. A similar argument can be applied to competition between nations, even hostile nations. They might want to develop killer robots, which is worrying in its own right, of course, but this is a different topic. But even these hostile nations like China, for example, do not want to have a killer robot that is selfish and power-seeking and that might turn against its maker. They want a killer robot that is obedient and that only kills the persons that it's instructed to kill, rather than the friendly forces. The criterion that biologists mostly use when it comes to distinguishing between domestication and natural selection is the control of reproduction. A species is domesticated when humans determine which organisms are allowed to reproduce with others. By that criterion, by the way, cats are domesticated to a lesser extent than dogs, because most cats, even house cats, still roam about and basically they still choose their own mates, so they're only semi or partly domesticated. If an animal escapes human control, if a dog goes feral and starts to reproduce on its own again, stray dogs, then we're no longer talking about domestication. So again, you can apply this to the evolution of AI system. What would it mean for artificial intelligence to go feral? They perhaps could behave something like a little bit like a computer virus. The computer viruses, of course, are not fully Darwinian evolution because they have all been designed by human agents, at least to some extent. They're not really evolving in the sense that you have random mutations and variations, but you do get something like a competition, a survival of the fittest, and the fittest in this context means the most infectious and also the most deceptive ones. So this is a problem that has indeed to some extent escaped our control. I'm not really sure exactly how we should imagine a scenario like that, but if AIs would ever escape from our control and start to reproduce and spawn copies of themselves, copies that involve more mutations and variations, then I think that could be, that could be a source of serious risk, because then we would expect the evolution of undesirable traits like selfishness and hunger for dominance over time, just like we see in biological evolution. This is something that I also published a paper on, parasites of the mind. So I'm actually partial to the idea, which is something that most philosophers reject, but I'm actually in the minority here, that some forms of culture are actually selfish and parasitical. Witch hunts, for example, provide a good example. Conspiracy theories. I think it is possible for culture to evolve interests, quote unquote, on its own that are not always aligned with human interests and that might sometimes end up subverting human interests. And I think it is possible, it is at least theoretically possible, that something like that would also happen with AI systems. I don't think it's really what is happening now, because at this point, AI systems, GPT, etc., are still very much under human domestication, but it is a scenario to keep in mind for the future. One scenario that was developed by Pedro Domingos in the master algorithm that looks a little bit like what it would look like for AI systems to evolve under blind and natural selection is, so he's imagining that there's a park where different skilled robots are allowed to compete with each other, and the winning robots are allowed to reproduce. I'm going to read the quote now. And their reproduction is achieved by programming the banks of 3D printers inside. Step by step, the robots become smarter, faster, and deadlier. So this is a scenario in which human beings set up a sort of natural environment in which the robots are allowed to evolve through blind natural selection to become more aggressive, more dangerous, and more deadly. This is Midjourney's impression or imagination of what such a robot park would look like. I think we could hopefully all agree that this would be a very bad idea. I'm reminded of Leslie Orgel's second evolution. Smarter than you are. I don't think you want to mess around with evolution, especially not if it's blind natural evolution. Something like that could really end very badly. Just a few words about natural instrumental convergence, because I'm expecting that this will probably be part of the discussion. And this is where Simon, my co-author, diverge a little bit. Most of the AI doom scenarios do not really involve this argument about evolution and natural selection. I think the majority of them are still based on instrumental convergence, which is basically the idea that if you have a form of intelligence, if you define intelligence as the ability to achieve your goals, whatever those goals are, whatever the goals of the future AI systems will be, it will almost inevitably involve instincts for self-preservation and for acquisition of resources and for dominance, for the simple reason that you cannot achieve any goal if you're dead. So if someone just terminates you, then of course you cannot fulfill your goals anymore. As Stuart Russell put it, you can't fetch coffee if you're dead. This is where I disagree. I think AI systems at this point only have goals in a very restricted sense. Human goals of evolved creatures, are unconditional, overarching. That means that they're operative in all contexts. They're always active. They're integrated unity of command. Basically, going to skip this because I just want to explain what I see as the main difference. And these organisms resist manipulation. So this instinct for self-preservation has been bred into us by evolution. But I think this is very different from almost all the AI systems that we have now. AI systems will probably, unless we deliberately choose otherwise, will have goals that are very much conditional, that are restricted to certain contexts, and that for that reason do not necessarily entail an instinct for self-preservation. Most computers and AI systems today are completely indifferent to being terminated or resetted or interrupted or whatever. And they will not resist updates. And I think there's no reason to assume that once you achieve a certain level of intelligence and once systems develop certain goals, quote unquote, because the term goal itself a little bit is leading here, that you will get all these other undesirable traits like an instinct for self-preservation to come along for the ride. Did Deep Blue want to beat Garry Kasparov? Yes, in a certain sense, it had the goal. That's what it was programmed for. But of course, this is a very outdated example already, of course. But a computer like Deep Blue would never resist being shut down, for example. It's completely indifferent about the game or about defeating its opponents outside of the context of the game. It's only within a certain restricted context that it has this goal. But unlike a human being, it doesn't really have any overarching and unconditional goals. I think I'm going to skip here. The galactic gorilla problem, that's just basically me saying that even though for most of the presentation I have been arguing against the doomers, I think Dan Hendrycks' argument about natural selection doesn't really get off the ground. I don't think this is a plausible scenario for the evolution of selfishness. But I do agree with the AI doomers that the notion of a predatory form of superintelligence, either biological or digital, is of course perfectly possible. Either you can think of an intelligence that have extraterrestrial origins. This is basically the plot line of the three-body problem and a bunch of other science fiction stories. You do not want to have close encounters of the third kind with evolved creatures that are selfish and dominance-seeking and that are way smarter than you are. That's just a very bad idea. By the same token, I think it would also be a very bad idea to evolve these creatures deliberately on our own planets, to breed creatures to become selfish and dominance hungry, to set up something like a robot park. But perhaps you can convince me otherwise, but I think unless we deliberately decide that we want to set up an environment where different AI systems are competing with each other according to blind natural selection and where the most selfish and the most aggressive and the most dangerous survive, I don't really think it is likely that we will end up in a future where we will be subjugated by AI systems. But if I have one piece of advice to give, it's we should not unleash the power of blind natural selection on AI systems. I don't think we're doing it right now, but I think it would be to do so because, and this is famously, of course, in the Netflix series based on the book of Cixin Liu, at some point in the story, the aliens, the aggressive, selfish, dominant aliens are basically sending us a message, humiliating us that you are bugs, basically echoing the gorilla problem by Stuart Russell, basically saying that we're just going to trample on you because you're completely worthless and insignificant to us. This is perfectly possible. It's either for something like that to evolve on a different planet or for something like that to evolve on our planet. But I think hopefully you're a little bit reassured that at this moment, this is not really what we're heading for. Thank you very much.
Thank you. That's a fascinating presentation. I'm sure a lot of people have questions. I'd see Creon has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. That was great presentation. So much interesting stuff. Really appreciate the
Thanks.
Especially the multidimensional stuff about the different evolution axes. But I want to just mention that the robot park idea, have you ever seen BattleBots or Robot Wars or something like that? It's not exactly the same, but it looks the same in the following sense. You've got these robots, they fight in the arena, they win or they lose.
Right.
Now, they have humans who build them and control them, but they win or they lose. And then based on who wins and who loses a given round, the robots all go back to their shops and the people fix them and modify them and tune them and evolve them. And then they go back into the arena and fight again. And no, it's exactly the same as having everything be autonomous, but it has its similarities. And what you end up with is within the constraints that are imposed, weight, class, and all these kinds of rules, the robots become more lethal and more able to withstand assault and conduct assault. But it's not like the robots turn on the audience. So it seems like, just for instance, you can just extend this to warfare or whatever you want, like just making more efficient killer robots. It's all fine as long as their goal is to fight each other.
That's right. And still do not resist being switched off by whoever who programmed them.
Yeah, anyway, that's all I wanted to say, is that the robot park exists and it's an actual kind of hit TV show in a way.
But you're saying that it already exists, but this is not really a cause for concern as long as they're just killing each other and they
I'm
do
just
not turn on
saying
the
that all I'm saying is it exists in a sort of hybrid human robot form, and it's interesting to look at because it's not a pure fantasy.
Yeah, that's interesting. And what is that called? So if I want to Google it or just want to, there's probably clips of that because I'm not familiar with it.
BattleBots, or there's several of them, or I think it's got a general name of like Robot Wars or Robot Competition.
Yeah, that's interesting. And it's not exactly like the robot park, as you say. I guess the most important difference is the autonomous reproductions. In the Domino scenario, the robots themselves are they're basically left alone for, I don't know, like thousands of years. And they spawn copies of themselves without any sort of human supervision. I think that's exactly where it tends to get dangerous. Although you can probably come up with a scenario in which, let's say that in one of these robot battles that you were really describing, I can imagine that an engineer is like trying to think of ways like, how can we make our robot more lethal and more successful in the competition? And then they recruit evolutionary algorithms to come up with a better robot. So that's already one step closer to the robot part, because then you're recruiting natural selection. This is also used for the design of the shape of the wings of an airplane, for example, because it's much more efficient to have multiple generations to basically recruit natural selection to come up with an efficient solution to whatever problem it is that you want to solve. I guess even that would still be fine as long as you're in control of the environment. You know when to stop the program, and you can still select whatever result is coming out as the best or the most lethal one.
I'm going to silence myself after this last comment, but I did want to mention that it's complicated, because if you have this fully autonomous robot park that you were proposing, a robot could just hack into the 3D printer system and produce many copies of itself without actually killing all the others. There's many ways for it to win, that besides just competition. Just like in the natural world, it's not just the biggest, strongest animals that survive. There's all kinds of survival strategies: reproduce fast, get small, be a parasite, all kinds of strategies.
Yeah, no, that's true. Yeah. There's probably a bunch of other questions because I see some hands.
And I also see that Simon has to leave. So maybe the next question.
Oh, yeah, then perhaps.
Or both. But Blake, I think you are next.
Ooh, sure. I also have to leave at the hour, so maybe I'll try to be quick. Maarten, amazing work. I'm a huge fan of this. So I was thinking about similar things, and in that sense, I wish I wrote your paper too, so I hope that's a compliment. But when I've thought about this problem, when I've thought about this problem, I get a little stuck or seeing like a complementary view to it, because I see two sort of extremes, and then the question of whether we want to end up somewhere in the middle. Because one extreme is the sort of natural selection of an organism that has no interest in us, and I think you're pretty clear in your stance of why we shouldn't do that. And there's this other extreme, which is we have full control over it. Yes, we've given it some objective, but it's not a self-preserving entity. If we want to turn it off, it's totally fine with that. And that would be this ideal case. If you're familiar with the blog post that says tool AIs want to be agent AIs, there seems like some pressure of, okay, we'd actually want to, it seems like what we're really looking for is something in the middle, where we don't just let it be like fine being turned off, actually, because we want something that's actually doing more for us. It's not just blindly following some instructions. And so if there's this pressure of building something that straddles the line between those two, do you find a way that we can actually, since we're safe if we stay off on one side, but if there's pressure to sit somewhere in between these, or we actually do want to give them more agency, how do you feel that we navigate that?
I'm actually reminded of another paper that Simon wrote. So perhaps this is a good way, Simon, to bring in your argument about symbiosis. Because can you explain, this is another paper that he wrote before me, where he's basically developing the idea that perhaps we should, rather than them dominating us or we dominating them, that we need to find some way of coexisting and just aligning our mutual interests without anyone being in charge. Right, Simon?
Yeah. So this refers to a paper that I wrote before. I am extremely concerned about rapid AI programs, I must say, and not all enthusiastic overall. In particular, because I think that even if we manage to control those machines, there's going to be just a few people in power, and this will lead to massive concentration of power with bad outcomes for the majority of us, and like with our cognitive tools, our cognitive skills being devalued and so on. And I thought that this means that this entire idea of alignment is problematic, and that the only thing that might work is like to really develop this throughout society in a very step-by-step and controlled and highly regulated way. I called that symbiosis in a paper in AI ethics. But it is just to as a general remark on what Maarten just presented. I think the argument is fine. We basically developed it together, and maybe Maarten's contribution is a bit bigger. It's just that for me, it mainly means that the human demise that I expect would be ill-described by natural selection. It would be just not really fit the framework of natural selection. I'm not very reassured by it. Like, possible that we would be fine. Still very worried. And I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, that's right. So that's basically where we diverge, that Simon thinks that this particular doom scenario will probably not happen, but it doesn't provide any reassurance about all the other ones. It would be a small comfort that we're screwed, but at least it was not because of evolution. But I do think, I also worry about some AI developments, obviously. For example, loss of human control in the sense that we will become more and more redundant. This is already something that, that I have experienced, and probably many of you, and I've already discussed it with Simon as well, that these large language models just become so good in whatever, just the writing, polishing text, even like drafting ideas. At some point, you become completely obsolete. And they will also become so good at catering to our human preferences in a way that probably exploits our vulnerabilities. Not exploits in the sense that they really have an intention to exploit us. So that again, I think would be just attributing intentions or agencies to them that is probably anthropomorphic. But in the same way that I think drugs and like tobacco or cocaine are exploiting our human frailties, you can just, along the same lines, you can imagine a scenario in which TikTok, for example, think about the doom scrolling that we're already experiencing. It's not that, of course, that the AIs just want to screw us up somehow or just want to make us miserable or depressed, but they have just found, just because of so many interactions with human beings, that there are certain things that we just cannot resist. So in a sense, they're still catering to human preferences. We're still selecting because we're the ones that clicking on certain things, except that these desires that we have are just very short-term cravings that are bad for us in the long run. And AI systems are just extremely good at honing in on these frailties. And I want to avoid the word exploiting because again, I think it's just too anthropomorphic. But even if they're not, if there's no intentionality involved at all, it's still worrying. It's obviously something to worry about. It's less bad than them like deliberately trying to exploit us, but it is still something that we should worry about. So I'm definitely not about everything when it comes to AI, but I am more optimistic about than Simon. That's true. Anyway, there's probably some more questions because I see more hands.
Stephen?
Yes. My great and grave concern, I think, is on your abstract, you say that the AIs may turn against us. They might turn it against us. But what I'm wondering is, I see more and more models, portability, ability to run locally being deployed, just spreading. And it's not so much that they may turn against us as we are combative and domineering in nature, and that we will build them to turn against other humans or other AI.
Yeah.
Not so that if that is the case, it's not the natural selection of the AIs competing in a marketplace so much as it's more like a war footing in weapons. And that's, I guess, where I'm wondering a lot about the humans making them is the problem.
Yeah.
And humans with bad intent or.
Yeah, I completely agree. But the only thing I would add is that this is very much in line with a range of other technologies where you see an arms race between on the offensive and the defensive sides, where different nations or different human beings or whatever are trying to, just basically destroy each other. And AI is just one in a long line of technologies that can be used for good and for ill. And it will probably be used for ill, like these killer robots. To some extent, they already exist. I wouldn't necessarily think that the offensive side has an advantage here. This is an argument that's been long running in AI circles that, like, okay, if you develop something like a killer robot, you probably also need AI systems then to defend us against the killer robots. So will we be put at a disadvantage on the defensive side? I don't necessarily think so. I'm not sure about that. This is something that we can worry about, but I take it that, so you are in agreement that if we should worry about anything, it's more about bad human intentions than the AIs just running amok and developing bad intentions of their own, right?
Yes and no. I think that we can't foresee so many knock-on effects, and similar to like nuclear weapons, mutually assured destruction doctrine, where they could do mass damage to infrastructure, take down systems, countries, civilization, as a potential. And it almost seems like we're in this sort of race with maybe between the US and China or whatever, is like who can build something that's more threatening, depending on who you're listening to, as a nature of a political race.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Maarten. And it was lovely to have Simon on as well. I think we should conclude this meeting. But it is so lovely. And also, I think a lot of you have the Discord details. So if you wanted to continue there, we could definitely do that. But anyway, thank you. And we'll see you all next month.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. My pleasure.